Dawn was a promise of death for her, a cold finality hanging in the air like frost on a wire, until he, the lonely black cowboy, decided to make a different promise. His promise was not to the dawn, nor to the town that thirsted for judgment, but to a memory of kindness in a world that had offered him so little. It was a promise to be paid in full, under the unforgiving gaze of a rising sun. Before we delve into this tale of sacrifice and silence, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you want to experience more stories like this one. The air in the town of Redemption was thin and sharp, smelling of dust and sanctimony. A gallows stood stark against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, a skeletal finger pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away. From the edge of town, Silas watched it. He sat atop his horse, a silhouette carved from the dying night, as much a part of the shadows as the scrub brush and the forgotten stones. He was a man who lived in the margins, his existence a quiet negotiation with a world that saw him as little more than a phantom. But today, the phantom would walk into the light. The town was beginning to stir, its windows glowing one by one with the flat yellow light of oil lamps. They were preparing for the spectacle, preparing to watch Alara hang. Silas felt the worn leather of his reins, the familiar weight a poor anchor in the swirling current of his thoughts. He had seen the verdict in their eyes long before the judge had spoken it. He had seen it in the way they looked at her, a woman whose only crime might have been to exist too beautifully, too sorrowfully, in a place that valued neither. His gaze drifted from the gallows to the small barred window of the sheriff's office. He knew what he had to do. It was a terrible and perfect calculus, an equation of loss that would, in the end, create a single defiant sum. He nudged his horse forward, the soft clopping of hooves on the dirt road the only sound in the world. It was the sound of a decision made, the sound of a life about to be traded. The horse moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step closing the distance between the anonymity of the plains and the suffocating judgment of the town. As Silas rode down the main street, faces appeared in the windows, curtains drawn back by cautious hands. Their eyes followed him, a current of silent questions and foregone conclusions. He was a known entity, but only in the way a storm cloud on the horizon is known, a potential for trouble, a darkness to be watched and weathered. He felt their stares not as individual pricks of curiosity, but as a single collective weight, the same weight he had felt in every town, on every dusty road. It was the crushing gravity of being seen but not known. He kept his own eyes fixed forward, on the raw timber of the sheriff's office, the final destination of this strange pilgrimage. The building seemed to sag under the weight of its own authority. For Silas, it was a temple of a faith he did not share, a place where justice was a commodity traded and sold, and where the color of a man's skin was the heaviest coin of all. He didn't belong here. The neatly painted signs, the swept boardwalks, the very air of ordered society, was a language he had never been taught to speak. His world was one of endless horizons and silent companionship with his horse, a world where a man was measured by his resilience against the elements, not by the whispers of his neighbors. Yet here he was, willingly walking into the heart of it all, into the one place designed to contain and crush men like him. He swung down from his horse, the motion fluid and practiced, a lifetime of movement distilled into a single, graceful act. He tied the reins to the hitching post, giving the horse a final, reassuring pat on the neck. Then he turned, and for the first time, he looked directly at the faces in the windows. He offered them nothing. No fear, no anger, no defiance, only a vast and unnerving stillness. And then he walked up the steps and pushed the door open. The memory arrived unbidden, as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. It was triggered by the smell of the sheriff's office, stale coffee and oiled steel, a scent that somehow conjured the opposite, the clean, vital smell of well water on a blistering afternoon. He remembered stumbling into Redemption weeks earlier, his body racked with fever, his horse lame. He had tried the stable, the saloon, the general store, seeking not charity, but a trade, work for water, labor for a patch of shade. Doors had been closed to him, faces had turned away, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to outright hostility. He was a blight, a problem to be ignored until it moved on. Dehydrated and dizzy, he had collapsed near the town well, his strength finally deserting him. He expected nothing. The world had taught him to expect nothing, and it had rarely been wrong. But then, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see her, Ilara. She held a wooden bucket, her face etched with a concern that seemed utterly alien in this place. She didn't speak to the men who watched from the porch of the mercantile, who muttered warnings to her. She simply knelt, dipped a tin cup into the cool water, and held it to his lips. The water was life, it was a sacrament. He drank, the coolness spreading through him, extinguishing a fire he thought would consume him. She said nothing, only watched him with eyes that held a deep, resonant sorrow of their own, as if she recognized the geography of his pain because it so closely mirrored her own. When he was done, she refilled the cup and left it beside him, along with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle of bread and dried meat. She walked away without a word, her back straight, absorbing the town's disapproval like a rock absorbs the heat of the sun. In that moment, she had not just given him water. She had given him witness. She had seen a man, not a phantom. And for a man who had been a ghost his entire life, that was a debt that could never truly be repaid. Back in the stale air of the present, Sheriff Miller looked up from his paperwork, his eyes small and hard like pebbles. He didn't invite Silas to sit. He simply waited, his posture a wall of preemptive denial. Miller was a man whose certainty was his shield and his weapon. He saw the world in simple terms: order and chaos, law and lawlessness, us and them. Silas stood firmly in the latter categories. "What do you want?" The sheriff's voice was flat, impatient. He had a hanging to oversee. He had no time for drifters. Silas took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch, letting it become a presence in the room. He looked past the sheriff, at the keys hanging on a hook by the wall, the keys to the cell where Ilara was counting the final minutes of her life. He had rehearsed no words, planned no grand speech. The truth of his purpose was too simple, too raw for eloquence. It had to be delivered like a blow. "Her," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "The woman. Ilara." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "What about her?" "She didn't do it," Silas stated. It was not an appeal. It was not a debate. It was a declaration, dropped into the quiet room with the finality of a closing door. Miller let out a short, humorless laugh. "Is that so? And I suppose you were there, saw the whole thing?" The sarcasm was thick, a tool to dismiss and diminish. Silas held his gaze, his own expression unreadable, a placid lake over a fathomless depth. He let the sheriff's mockery fade into the silence. Then he delivered the second blow, the one that would shatter the morning's grim schedule. "I was there," he said, his voice unwavering. "I was there because I'm the one who did it. I killed her husband." He watched the disbelief curdle into confusion on the sheriff's face. He saw the man's rigid world begin to fracture. In that moment, Silas was not a drifter, not a phantom. He was an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of their tidy, brutal justice. The confession hung in the air between them, more potent and more dangerous than any weapon. The past bled into the present again, not with the softness of a memory of kindness, but with the jagged edge of remembered violence. Silas had not left town after Ilara's charity. He had stayed, lingering on the outskirts, taking small, unwanted jobs, his presence a quiet act of defiance. He had stayed because he felt a pull, a strange sense of responsibility for the woman who had shown him mercy. And so, he had become an unwilling observer of her life. He saw her husband, Marcus Thorne, a man who owned half the town and wore his power like a royal cloak. But Silas saw what lay beneath the cloak. He saw it in the way Thorne spoke to his wife in the street, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. He saw it in the flinch of a stable hand when Thorne approached. He saw it in the bruises that sometimes shadowed Ilara's porcelain skin, bruises she tried to hide with a high collar or a downcast gaze. One evening, Silas was mending a fence near the Thorne property, the setting sun casting long, skeletal shadows. He heard voices, sharp and angry. Thorne and Ilara were in their garden. Thorne's voice was a whip, cracking with accusations and contempt. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You are mine," he hissed, his face a mask of possessive rage. "You will remember your place." Ilara did not cry out. She stood rigid, her face a pale, defiant stone, her silent endurance a fortress against his onslaught. Silas watched from the shadows, his hands clenched on the rough wood of the fence post, the splinters digging into his palms. He knew this kind of man. He had seen this casual cruelty his whole life, wielded by men who believed their power gave them the right to own and to break. He felt an old, familiar rage rise in him, a fire he had learned long ago to bank and control, lest it consume him. He did not intervene. He was a black man in a white man's town. To act would have been his own death sentence, and so he watched, his impotence a bitter poison in his throat. He watched, and he remembered. "Lies!" Sheriff Miller spat, his composure regained, his certainty snapping back into place like a bone reset. "You're lying to protect her. What is she to you?" He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, a predator trying to intimidate its prey. But Silas was not prey. He was something else entirely, something the sheriff had no name for. "She's nothing to me," Silas said, and the lie was so close to the truth that it felt honest. "I saw my chance, and I took it. Thorne had a fat wallet. He caught me. We fought." The story unspooled from him, cold and clinical. He used the details he had gathered from the periphery, the whispers and rumors he'd overheard in the days following the murder. He described the layout of the Thorne house, a detail he knew from mending the fence. He described the heavy silver candlestick on the mantelpiece, an object he'd seen through the window, now repurposed as the murder weapon in his narrative. He was stronger than he looked, Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "But I was faster. He fell. I took the money and I ran." He met the sheriff's skeptical gaze without blinking. He was offering them a story they wanted to believe, a narrative that fit their world. The dangerous, nameless drifter, the opportunistic thief, the violent black man. It was so much simpler, so much more satisfying than the complicated truth of a woman pushed to the edge by a powerful man. He could see the gears turning in Miller's head. The town wanted a hanging. They wanted a clean resolution, a monster to punish so they could all sleep soundly. Elara, the grieving widow turned cold-blooded killer, had fit the role. But Silas, the dark phantom from the plains, fitted even better. He was the perfect scapegoat, a vessel for all their fears. "Why come back?" the sheriff asked, the final test. "Why confess now?" Silas allowed a small, bitter smile to touch his lips. "The money's gone, and I'd rather hang on a full stomach than starve on the prairie." It was a brutal, cynical answer, and it was exactly what the sheriff needed to hear. The sheriff led him to the empty cell, the one adjacent to Elara's. The iron door clanged shut, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. Silas was home. He had been in cells before, for vagrancy, for suspicion, for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this was different. This was a choice. He walked to the small, barred window, the same kind of window he imagined Elara had been staring through for weeks. The view was of a brick wall and a sliver of sky, a cruel parody of the endless horizons he knew. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron bars and closed his eyes. The image that came to him was not of Elara, but of his younger sister, Sarah. It was a memory from a lifetime ago, a memory seared into his soul. They had been sharecroppers then, bound to land that wasn't theirs, living under the thumb of a man much like Marcus Thorne. Sarah had a spirit like a wildfire, bright and untamable. The landowner had noticed her, his gaze possessive and hungry. Silas, a boy then, had seen the danger. He had told her to be careful, to be quiet, to bend so she would not break. He had preached caution because he was afraid. One night, the man came to their cabin. Silas had stood by, frozen with a boy's terror while his father tried to reason, to plead. It had ended in violence. His father was beaten, and Sarah was taken. They never saw her again. The guilt had been his constant companion ever since. It was the ghost that rode with him across the plains, the silence that sat with him by the campfire. He had been a boy then, powerless, but he was a man now. He could not save Sarah. He could not undo the past. But he could stand in the path of the same storm, for someone else. He could absorb the blow he had been too weak to take before. This act, this trade of his life for Elara's, was not for her. It was for Sarah. It was a final, desperate prayer for an absolution he knew he could never truly earn. It was the only way to silence the ghost. The turning of a key in the lock was a harsh, grinding sound that tore through the quiet tension of the cell block. Silas heard the sheriff's heavy boots, then his clipped, formal voice. "Ilara Thorne, you're free to go. There's been a confession." Silas stood at the bars of his cell, waiting. He heard a soft gasp, then the shuffling of feet. A moment later, she was being led past his cell. Her eyes, wide with disbelief and dawning horror, found his. Time seemed to stop. In that shared gaze, 1,000 unspeakable things were exchanged. He saw her confusion, the frantic search for an explanation. He saw her fear, not for herself anymore, but for him. And beneath it all, he saw the flicker of a terrible, profound understanding. She was beginning to see the shape of his sacrifice. In his own eyes, he hoped she saw not pity or heroism, but a simple, unchangeable peace. He tried to convey the entirety of his reasoning in that one look. The memory of water at the well, the shadow of his sister's fate, the finality of his choice. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a confirmation. An acceptance, a farewell. The sheriff pulled her along. "What is this? Why is he—" Her voice was a fragile whisper, breaking on the edge of hysteria. "Justice, ma'am," the sheriff said, his tone dripping with a self-satisfied irony. "The real killer has been found." Ilara looked back one last time, her face a canvas of anguish. The debt. He could see her realizing the weight of the debt she now carried, a life given to her that she could never repay. It was a burden he had to give her, the necessary cost of her freedom. He watched until she was gone, a ghost of a woman being led out into a sun she was never meant to see again. Then he turned away from the door and faced the wall of his cell. The transaction was complete. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Dawn arrived, not as a gentle promise, but as a cold, impartial witness. The light seeped into the town, washing the streets in pale, watery colors, illuminating the gallows that awaited him. They came for him, the sheriff and a deputy, their faces grim and professional. There was no malice in their eyes now, only the weary resolve of men doing a job. Silas offered no resistance. He moved with a strange and placid grace, as if he were a guest being led to a feast, not a man being led to his death. As they walked him through the town, he saw the faces of the same people who had scorned him, who had condemned Ilara. Their expressions were different now. The righteous fury was gone, replaced by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a disquieting awe. They had wanted a monster, and he had given them one. But as he walked toward the scaffold, his head held high, his gaze clear and steady, he did not look like a monster. He looked like something else, something they couldn't quite understand, and it unsettled them. He ascended the wooden steps, the coarse timber rough beneath his worn boots. From the platform, he could see over the rooftops of the town, to the vast open plains beyond, his true home. He saw the horizon, a clean, sharp line where the earth met the sky, and he felt a sense of release. He scanned the small crowd, his eyes searching, and then he saw her. Ilara stood at the edge of the assembly, shrouded in a dark cloak, almost invisible, but he found her. Their eyes met one last time across the space that separated the living from the dying. There was no need for any more signals, any more silent conversations. He simply held her gaze, anchoring himself to it. The executioner placed the rough hood over his head, plunging him into darkness. He smelled the hemp rope, felt the chill of the morning air on his skin. His last thought was not of fear or regret, or even of Sarah. It was of the sky, the vast, empty, and forgiving sky. He was finally going home. The thud of the trapdoor was a stark, ugly sound, a full stop at the end of a sentence. It echoed for a moment in the stunned silence of the crowd, then was swallowed by the morning. The spectacle was over. The town of redemption had its justice. Slowly the people began to disperse, their morbid duty done. They walked away in small, quiet groups, avoiding each other's eyes, eager to return to the simple routines of their lives, to the coffee and chores that would help them forget the grim business of the dawn. They left the square empty, save for the grim structure that still cast its long shadow in the rising sun. But one person did not leave. Ilara remained, a solitary figure wrapped in her dark cloak. She stood frozen, watching the place where he had been, as if by staring hard enough she could rewind time, could refuse the terrible gift he had given her. The sun climbed higher, its light now warm and golden, promising a beautiful day, a mockery of the morning's events. She was free. The word felt hollow, meaningless. Freedom was a vast and terrifying country, and he had stranded her on its shore with no map and no compass, only the crushing weight of his memory as her guide. She thought of the cup of water. Such a small gesture. A simple act of human decency in a world that had shown her so little. She had not known that such a small act could incur such an impossible debt. He had taken her guilt, her fear, and her condemnation, and woven them into a cloak of protection for her, paying for it with the only thing he had left, his life. She finally turned to leave, her steps unsteady. She did not know where she would go or what she would do, but she knew this: she would live. She would live for him. She would carry his story in the silence of her heart, and in the vast, lonely expanse of the life he had purchased for her, she would search for a way to make it mean something.